I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Why are women more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease than men? Does estrogen have anything to do with this? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
2 out of 3 people with Alzheimer's disease are women. Do you know someone with this condition? It can have a devastating impact on families as well as the individual.
What factors put us all at risk for developing dementia? A surprising number of medications have anticholinergic activity that can harm the brain. Many of these are routinely prescribed to women.
Are there toxins in our environment that could cause trouble? How can we avoid them?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, how women can reduce their risk for dementia.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, researchers have been measuring the toll of excess death from the COVID-19 pandemic. 2 research letters published in JAMA show that about 20% more Americans died from March through August or September than normal. Usually, the death toll doesn't vary very much from one year to another. Not all of the excess deaths have shown up in the statistics officially attributed to COVID-19. Some of those people may have died of undiagnosed COVID-19. Others could have died from different causes, such as a heart attack for which they didn't seek care due to fear of contracting the virus at the hospital. Some of those excess deaths may even have been due to suicide related to unemployment, isolation, or grief. New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts accounted for about 30% of the excess deaths due to their extremely high peaks in infection last spring. An editorial notes that under these circumstances, an intense, persistent, multi-pronged, and coherent response must be the order of the day and an urgent priority for the nation.
The second research letter also shows significant excess deaths during this period. In addition, a comparison of the U.S. with other countries shows that we did not fare as well as most. The authors point out that the U.S. has had a COVID-19 mortality rate of 60.3 per 100,000 people. In Canada, the rate was 24.6 per 100,000, and Australia had a rate of 3.3 per 100,000. If the U.S. had kept its rate comparable to Canada's, more than 100,000 Americans who died from COVID-19 would still be alive.
People all around the world are waiting impatiently for vaccines or monoclonal antibody treatments that might help control the pandemic. This week brought bad news on several fronts. Johnson & Johnson is one of the key vaccine developers. This week, it put a hold on its Phase 3 trial due to an unexplained illness in one of the volunteers. The company is trying to determine whether it's an adverse reaction to the vaccine. This follows on the heels of a pause for a different vaccine. AstraZeneca resumed its testing in the UK, South Africa, Brazil, India, and Japan, but the FDA has not yet finished its investigation to allow testing to restart in the U.S. In addition, Eli Lilly has announced a temporary halt to its clinical trial of monoclonal antibodies used to neutralize SARS-CoV-2. The Data Safety Monitoring Board detected a safety problem. The company has not yet identified the nature of the problem. Lilly is also in trouble with the FDA for quality control problems in its New Jersey plant. With 3 promising trials on hold, it will be several weeks before we know more about the problems.
Scientists are still learning how the SARS-CoV-2 virus behaves. Public health authorities have been stressing the importance of person-to-person contact. The CDC recently changed its guidance to include aerosol transmission beyond 6 feet. Australian scientists have just determined that the coronavirus can stay viable on a variety of surfaces for a surprisingly long time. They tested both paper and plastic money, stainless steel, glass, and cotton cloth. The investigators also tested virus survival on vinyl, commonly used to protect mobile phone screens and grab handles on public transport. They found that the virus could survive nearly a month on money, glass, vinyl, and steel at room temperature. They caution that touch screens on cell phones, ATMs, airport check-in kiosks, and grocery store self-service checkout stations could be contaminated. At 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the virus survived up to 14 days on cotton. Japanese researchers have also investigated coronavirus survival. They found that SARS-CoV-2 could persist up to 11 hours on human skin. That's a much longer time than the influenza virus and might contribute to the high transmissibility of COVID-19. Both studies reinforce the public health importance of hand washing for helping to control the spread of this disease. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Today we're talking about women's brains. Why are women more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease than men? 2 out of every 3 patients are female. How do hormones affect brain function? What else increases women's chances of developing dementia?
Our guest today is an expert on the connection between hormones and neurological function. Dr. Lisa Mosconi is the director of the Women's Brain Initiative and associate director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College, where she serves as an associate professor of neuroscience in neurology and radiology. In addition, she's an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Department of Psychiatry. She's the author of Brain Food and her latest book, The XX Brain, the groundbreaking science empowering women to maximize cognitive health and prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Lisa Mosconi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure to be here with you today.
Well, thank you for joining us. Dr. Mosconi, your research has focused on women, and in particular, women's brains. How did you get interested in this topic as a researcher?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. So I grew up in a family of scientists. My parents are both nuclear physicists. They're professors and researchers. So I got involved into neuroscience very early on because my mom was teaching nuclear physics to students who were babysitting me. And at the same time, they were studying nuclear physics to apply that to nuclear medicine, which is a branch of radiology where you see these beautiful pictures of the brain in all different sorts of colors, in blue and red and yellow and green. And I thought it was fascinating. And I think I was 8 when I first told my mom that I was going to be a psychiatrist. And everyone in my family panicked because they thought it was not really as fancy as nuclear physics. But so the other reason for me is really very personal. When I was about 18, 19, my grandmother, who lived across the landing from our apartment, started showing signs of cognitive deterioration, and she developed Alzheimer's disease a few years afterwards. And she was one of 4 siblings, 3 sisters and 1 brother. And all 3 sisters eventually developed Alzheimer's disease and died of it, whereas the brother was spared. So that was very shocking for us as a family. And we were, my mother was the primary caregiver, but we were all involved and affected in many, many ways, not just emotionally, but also from a very practical perspective. And I went to my college professors and then to my PhD mentors, and I kept asking, does it matter if you're a woman or a man? Is the risk of Alzheimer's disease higher for women? Am I screwed? Am I in trouble? Is my mother in trouble? What do we do? And back then, there was no answer.
Now, Dr. Mosconi, in your book, the XX Brain, you suggest that there are answers now. Are women more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease?
There are some answers now, and many of the answers, I'm proud to say, really came out of our lab. And there seems to be a strong link between Alzheimer's disease and female gender that I have been personally exploring for the past 20 years. And the point is that, let me tell you why this is important for women. Historically, two assumptions were made about women and Alzheimer's disease. And the assumptions were women live longer than men, and Alzheimer's disease is a disease of old age. So it's obvious the more women than men have Alzheimer's disease, which is a way to just kind of dismiss the question completely, right? We're happy that women live longer. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's affects the elderly, so there's nothing we can do about it. And over time, it turns out that, well, women don't live that much longer than men, to be clear. In the United States, the difference is about 4.5 years, not 20, right? Not 10. It's just a couple of years. And in England, for example, the difference is 2.5 years, 2 to 3 years. But Alzheimer's disease and dementia is the leading cause of death for women and not for men, even though the longevity gap is just a couple of years. So clearly there's more than just longevity. And what is perhaps even more important is that over the past few years, we have learned that Alzheimer's disease is not a disease of old age. It's a disease that is very insidious. It's very slow for many patients, and it starts with negative changes in the brain years, if not decades, prior to clinical symptoms. So for most Alzheimer's patients in the United States, the age of onset is about 71 years, but the brain changes that eventually lead to the memory loss, the confusion, the clinical symptoms, the cognitive deterioration start decades prior. So that really changed my question to what happens to women and not to men in midlife, right? Because decades prior to age 70 bring us to age 50-ish. So what happens to women in midlife that could potentially trigger Alzheimer's disease or increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease? And by looking at brain scans and doing a lot of research, we've learned that menopause really plays a key role for women's brains.
When you say menopause is a key factor, that suggests hormones. Yeah. Is that the difference between men's brains and women's brains? The level of various hormones?
It is a very big difference, yes. And just to clarify that, as a person goes through life and moves through life, they're going to be more or less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease or dementia or other neurological issues because of a number of factors, like genetics, medical history, lifestyle, and whatnot. However, each one of us has a number of things that protects us along the way. And one of those things are the hormones that really protect and in a way supercharge the brain. And this is a little bit counterintuitive because we think about our sex hormones like testosterone for men and estrogens for women as being involved in fertility and reproduction, which they are. What most people don't realize is that these same hormones really have a strong impact on the health of the brain. So for example, estrogen, and especially estradiol, which is the most potent form of estrogen in women, is involved in a number of brain functions. We refer to estradiol as the master regulator of the female brain. It's like the orchestra director that coordinates a number of different things that need to happen, from neuroplasticity, from growth of new brain cells, to the immune system is involved, and most importantly, brain energy. At the cellular level, estradiol, estrogens in general, literally push your brain cells, your neurons, to work harder to make energy. So when your estrogen is high, your brain energy is high. But then the problem is that women lose this estrogens and their power and their strength in midlife during menopause, whereas this does not happen to men until much later on in life.
Dr. Mosconi, what about testosterone? Because we know testosterone is important for men and for women for a number of biological functions. Does testosterone have any impact on women's brains?
It does. All hormones are helpful for sure. The problem is that women's brains are literally wired to work and run on estrogens. If you look at the amount of hormones that we have in the brain, men have a lot of testosterone or androgens and very little estrogens. And for women, it's the opposite, it's the other way around. We have almost 90% estrogen, let's say 80% estrogens, and just a little bit of testosterone. So it is helpful, but it can't replace the estradiol. And then these differences in hormonal composition and the way that the brain responds to hormones is something that we're born with. It's ingrained in our DNA, the fact that we have different genes, right? Women have the XX genotype, men have the XY, and immediately from the time of conception, these genes dictate different protein profiles to some extent, different hormone production, and also the way that the brain grows. So in the brain, the way the hormones work is really fascinating. It's like a key in the lock. The hormones are the key, and then you need to have a receptor that is the lock. And what's really important is when the key gets in the lock and turns on the lock, triggering a number of reactions that are very important, like energy production, the immune system is boosted, or neurons start growing. Mm-hmm. And women come with a lot of estrogen receptors that become basically unutilized during menopause.
You're listening to Dr. Lisa Mosconi, Director of the Women's Brain Initiative and Associate Director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College. She also serves as an Associate Professor of Neuroscience in Neurology and Radiology. In addition, she's an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Department of Psychiatry. She's the author of Brain Food, and her latest book, The XX Brain, the groundbreaking science empowering women to maximize cognitive health and prevent Alzheimer's disease.
After the break, we'll talk about some common myths regarding women and Alzheimer's disease.
Genes don't necessarily determine our destiny. That's good news for some of us who have mothers or grandmothers with dementia.
Particular drugs pose a special risk for the brain. We call them anticholinergic medicines. There's a surprisingly large number of drugs that have anticholinergic activity.
How can we reduce our exposure to anticholinergics?
You might want to limit your use of PM pain medicines, sleeping pills, and diphenhydramine.
The Mediterranean diet is reputed to be good for the brain. Are there studies to back that up?
If you don't start focusing on vegetables, fruit, and olive oil until you're 60 or 70, is that too late?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code PEOPLES25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. CocoVia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is People's 10. Learn more at cocovia.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocovia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
Today we're exploring why women are more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease than men. There are a number of factors involved. Are there ways that women can reduce their risk of developing dementia?
Our guest is Dr. Lisa Mosconi. She's the director of the Women's Brain Initiative and associate director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College, where she serves as an associate professor of neuroscience in neurology and radiology. In addition, she's an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Department of Psychiatry. She's the author of Brain Food and the XX Brain, the groundbreaking science empowering women to maximize cognitive health and prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Dr. Mosconi, another of the myths that you write about in the XX Brain is the idea that genes are destiny. And of course, since this was part of why you got so interested in women's brains and cognitive impairment as we grow older, why do you consider that a myth?
Well, it turns out that it is a myth. When I started school, which is now a long time ago, we were taught that your DNA was pretty much everything, and that there was very little that you could do to change your destiny or change your future, but just living a certain lifestyle or making certain choices, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's disease or brain health in general. And that's because we had this idea of the brain as being relatively isolated to the rest of the body and protected from the rest of the body. And now instead, there is an understanding that your lifestyle, your medical health, your environment, these are all factors that actually impact not just the health of the body, but also the health of the brain, which is good news and bad news depending on your lifestyle, right? So if you're very healthy and you make all the right choices, you're really strengthening your brain at the same time. But if you're making the wrong choices, you might be harming your brain in return.
Well, we are going to talk about those choices so that we can all make better choices. But first, Joe has a question.
Well, I'd like to ask you about a myth you mention in your book regarding what I call the silver bullet. The idea that drug companies are poised to deliver an antidote to Alzheimer's disease, that there's going to be some kind of miracle medicine that will save the day. Why is that a myth?
Well, I would say perhaps it's a hope, right, more than a myth. But the way that the field of Alzheimer's disease developed was really about finding targets. And for this super long time, everybody was looking at amyloid beta plaques, or Alzheimer's plaques, as the only thing that led to Alzheimer's disease and the cause of all evils. And the vast majority of pharmaceutical development in the field has been really focused on removing these plaques. So we now have some vaccines in the pipeline that are able to remove amyloid plaques from the brain. However, that so far has not led to any cognitive improvement or any changes for the best. There's a lot that still needs to be done, and there are some really encouraging results. However, I do not believe that taking drugs is the only solution for Alzheimer's disease. And so, I mean, it's not just me, obviously, but the field is really moving towards prevention. We're finally talking about preventing Alzheimer's rather than waiting until it's too late and hoping that a drug will solve all these problems. And the reason that we're looking at prevention is what I was mentioning before, that Alzheimer's disease takes a really long time to develop. So we have years, if not decades, during which we can really change our lifestyle, improve our medical health, change the environment as much as possible, and support our brains in a way that is protective against Alzheimer's disease. And once you have a really strong baseline and background, then let's say that a drug does come along that can help you, you're really going to make sure that you support the drug in turn. So I think two things really need to happen. And I think for most people, if you can prevent a disease rather than having to cure it afterwards, is still a plus.
Absolutely. And as a pharmacologist, reducing risks is something that I really value, which leads me to a question about drugs. Not so much drugs that are going to save the day, the miracle medicine that I referred to, but drugs that pose a risk for the brain. And I'm thinking about a class of medications called anticholinergics, because as you well know, acetylcholine is critical for brain function and particularly for memory. And there was just an article published recently in the journal Neurology that followed hundreds of people over a decade. And what they reported was that this general class of drugs called anticholinergics, the more of these drugs that people were taking, the so-called anticholinergic burden, the greater the risk for cognitive decline, ultimately for Alzheimer's disease. And if people had a genetic risk factor like ApoE4, that particular gene, and they were taking one or more of these anticholinergic drugs, the risk went up doubled or quadrupled. So the importance of eliminating or reducing as much as possible exposure to anticholinergic drugs.
Yes, there's been evidence that for correlations mostly between use of this kind of drugs, which, by the way, include Benadryl, right, which is one of the most commonly used drugs for allergies. But also, I found out just recently, people take Benadryl to sleep.
Lots of people do. It's the PM and all those PM pain relievers.
I know, it's just so, well, it makes sense, right? Yes, it definitely gets you drowsy. But there are possible side effects. And I think that these associations you mentioned are strong. It's hard to show causality unless you really do a clinical trial. That would be completely unethical, of course. But I do believe that is a strong enough correlation to take it seriously. And of course, if you have an allergy, well, perhaps you know what to do if you have an allergy. You don't want to take allergy medications. And there are other types of medicines that do not negatively impact your production of acetylcholine. I think if we're taking these drugs without necessarily needing them so badly, we might be doing our brains a disservice. But I have this philosophy for really all drugs. Like sleeping pills also have a negative impact on brain health, and they have been associated with a higher risk of Alzheimer's. Benzodiazepines is the same. And it looks like it's not the same for everyone. There's a lot of variability, but I think it's really important to know and be aware of these associations and discuss them with your doctor, because there are other solutions that are available. And very often, you don't really need a drug, you don't need a medicine to achieve a certain result. And something that I find fascinating about acetylcholine is that it is a neurotransmitter that is key for memory formation. And the kind of drugs that we give to Alzheimer's patients really that are FDA approved, they're not a vaccine, they're not a cure, but they do help. And they really make sure that acetylcholine stays in the brain for as long as possible. And something I found interesting is that the production of acetylcholine is actually impacted by your diet. So there are some foods that contain choline, which is a substance that acts like a B vitamin, more or less, that is really key for production of this neurotransmitter in the brain.
Let's talk about those foods, if you don't mind, Dr. Mosconi. What foods are you recommending for your friends and patients who say, how can I keep my brain healthy? And do women need to start eating these foods even before menopause?
Yes, yes. I think the sooner you start changing your lifestyle and your diet in particular for the best in a way that is supportive of brain health, really the better. And more or less there is agreement that the Mediterranean style diet is really supportive of brain health and is protective against Alzheimer's disease, at least is associated with a lower risk.
So let's run through the basics of the Mediterranean style diet because we talk about it a lot, but I'm not convinced that everybody knows exactly what we mean when we say a Mediterranean style diet. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Mosconi, you have some personal experience with a Mediterranean style diet. Is that true?
Oh, yes, I have a lot of experience. So I was born and raised in Italy, in Florence. And I studied in France in high school. I went to a French high school. So those are all Mediterranean countries. And if you ask an Italian if French food is Mediterranean, the answer is absolutely not.
And probably the same way, if you ask a French person, well, is Italian food the best Mediterranean model? They probably say, oh no, French food is better.
French food is better for sure. So I think the traditional Mediterranean diet, which is what all these papers refer to, is a plant-centric diet. So usually the focus is on fresh, local vegetables and fruit, whole grains and legumes, with vegetable oils used in prevalence, and we use vegetable oils in preference to animal fat.
Let me pause you right there, Dr. Mosconi, yes. Because when you say vegetable oil and Italy, I think of...
We're thinking of olive oil.
Yes.
Not sesame seed oil, not peanut oil.
That's right.
Not corn oil.
No. So extra virgin olive oil and flax oil to some extent. And the thing about these oils is that they're very rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids rather than saturated fat. And they're also quite rich in phytonutrients and vitamin E. So they have an antioxidant capacity than is perhaps higher than in other types of vegetable oil. Like everybody here uses coconut oil, which is delicious, but is not the same as extra virgin olive oil.
So, Dr. Mosconi, we've got the vegetables, we've got the fruits, we've got the olive oil or the flaxseed oil, we've got nuts and legumes. Mm-hmm. Now, where are we getting the choline? Because you said we should be eating foods that supply a good amount of choline.
There. That's right. Fish is actually also a main staple of the diet and is also a good source of choline. But so are peanuts. Peanut butter actually is surprisingly.
I'll bet they don't eat peanut butter very much in Italy.
No, we don't.
But what about eggs? I understand egg yolks.
Yes, also that was my number 3. So I would say plants first, fish second with eggs, and then dairy and meat is consumed more sparingly, more like a treat. And also one important feature of the Mediterranean diet is that there is really no processed food at all.
And when I think of Italy, I think of desserts.
Pizza. What are you talking about? How about pizza?
I actually do think of pizza because there are a lot of pizza restaurants in Italy. But I also think that when you have dessert, that it's not as loaded with sugar as it is here in the United States. I think of a lot of fruits. How damaging?
Well, in Florence, we think of gelato.
Well, there is gelato. Let's not forget that. But it's a treat. It's not something people eat every day. So how important is it to be cautious about our sugar intake?
Oh, it's incredibly important. I think portion size is really important. Being aware of all the different sources of hidden sugars, right? Because I find that sugar is added to most foods here in the United States, in a way, is kind of sneaky. Like, you don't know the sugar is there unless you really read the labels. And there's a carbohydrate breakdown that is fiber and then sugar. And then the sugar is broken down into natural sugar that should be in the food and added sugar. And sometimes you can get like 20 grams of added sugar per serving in a slice of bread. Even in like very healthy whole wheat sprouted bread, is like 20 grams of added sugar. So I find that very slightly upsetting in some ways.
Yes.
You really have to pay attention to what you're eating. And all this sugar has terrible consequences, especially on metabolic health, that is so important for women. So one reason the Mediterranean diet is specifically recommended for women is that it's very rich in fiber. And fiber has a balancing effect on hormones, whereas refined sugar has the opposite effect. So it's really important to go for foods that contain a lot more fiber than sugar, and also foods that contain more natural sugars than added sugars, right?
Yes, I think that is very important. So in short, Dr. Mosconi, it seems like we should all start eating a Mediterranean diet, hopefully in our 30s or 40s. If we are already in our 60s or our 70s, is it too late?
It is not. You just need to be more consistent, right? Because if you start when you're 30, you have really a lot of time and you can have a cheat day here and there. But I think the older we get, the more consistent we need to be to really reap the effects of these nutrients and be sure that you're protecting your brain. And maybe we can talk about it later, but we see that on brain scans, that it's never too late to start, but really consistency is key.
You're listening to Dr. Lisa Mosconi, Director of the Women's Brain Initiative and Associate Director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College. She also serves as Associate Professor of Neuroscience in Neurology and Radiology. In addition, she's an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Department of Psychiatry. She's the author of Brain Food and her new book, The Double X Brain.
So, Terry, let's recap what type of diet can contribute to optimum brain health. First, the Mediterranean diet has lots of fruits and vegetables rich in fiber.
Well, also, olive oil has polyphenols that might be helpful for the brain. And don't forget the choline in fish and eggs and peanuts.
And it's especially important to stay away from added sugar, except on special occasions like when you're visiting Italy and having a gelato. And remember, reading labels really does make sense, especially when it comes to checking how much sugar or carbohydrate is in the food.
I think it's really good news. You can start even when you're older, although it would be best to be consistent starting at a young age. Even people in their 60s and 70s can benefit from a Mediterranean-style eating pattern.
After the break, we'll discuss the connection between cholesterol and the brain.
How about exercise? It's good for our hearts. Is there exercise that benefits women's brain?
We'll also find out what to do about environmental toxins, hormones, and we'll get Dr. Mosconi's perspective on the timing of estradiol replacement therapy.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This People's Pharmacy podcast is brought to you in part by Verizana.com.
Verizana Lab offers home health tests that allow you to monitor your hormones and health conditions. You can take control of the quantitative assessment of your health and learn about male and female hormone balance, the stress hormone cortisol, leaky gut, gluten intolerance, or your gut microbiome.
Take a more active role in tracking your health and take 20% off your first order of a mail-in testing opportunity with the discount code PEOPLE. That's PEOPLE, all uppercase. To learn more, go to Verizana.com. That's Verizana.com. SANA.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
Today, we're talking about brain health, especially as it affects women. What toxins should we be avoiding?
Our guest is Dr. Lisa Mosconi, Director of the Women's Brain Initiative and Associate Director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College. She also serves as Associate Professor of Neuroscience in Neurology and Radiology. In addition, she's an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Department of Psychiatry. She's the author of Brain Food and her latest book, The Double X Brain.
Dr. Mosconi, we've been talking about food. We've been talking about choline as an important ingredient in food and the formation of acetylcholine, that important neurotransmitter. I'd like to talk just a bit about cholesterol because it's been highly controversial. I mean, Mr. Cholesterol used to be the enemy, and we would do anything and everything we could think of to get cholesterol down. And yet it's my understanding that cholesterol is critical for myelin, the sheath around neurons, and is essential for the brain to function well. So how do we balance our anti-cholesterol crusade with the need for cholesterol in the brain?
I am very happy you're asking because I find that there's some confusion around cholesterol in the brain. And as a neuroscientist, I can attest to the fact that cholesterol from the diet has no impact whatsoever on the cholesterol that's in your brain. They're completely isolated. There is no relationship. No cholesterol from your blood can even get inside your head. So this is something that is new and perhaps unexpected, but I can assure you it's in every neurochemistry textbook that the brain makes its own cholesterol when we're born. And it seals your cholesterol away from the rest of the body because it's so specifically important, like you said, for the myelin that covers the axons and for brain development. So the brain makes its own cholesterol, and there is no exchange between cholesterol in brain and cholesterol in blood.
So if we eat an egg or 2 or maybe 3 eggs a week for the choline that they contain, we don't need to worry about it providing cholesterol to our brains, but it may provide cholesterol to the rest of our bodies, and that could get our doctors pretty excited, and then they might prescribe a statin to lower our cholesterol. Do statins have any impact on the brain?
Not directly. Well, I think there's quite a lot of research that's been done on statins. Also, I want to clarify the point I was making before. And my point was that you don't need to eat cholesterol to protect your brain or to help your brain. So all these diets that promote high fat intake by saying that the brain is made of fat, so you need to eat the fat because it goes inside your brain and replenishes your fat stores in brain. This is just completely incorrect. What is important to know, though, is that if you eat a lot of fat, including cholesterol, for some people that could lead to cardiovascular issues. It's not universal. It varies with age. It varies with gender. There are a lot of factors that impact that. Many doctors prescribe statins if your cholesterol is too high. I wish they would prescribe a healthier diet and more exercise first or together with the statins.
So do we.
That's right. Well, it's also common sense, right? If you can bring your cholesterol down by eating oatmeal, perhaps, or walking, or running, or doing yoga, or doing something that you like that really helps your body moving and you burn that fat, I think is definitely a good thing to consider. And we know that in the United States, people don't exercise as much as they could or should, especially women, and especially women over 40. So I think it's important to mention that we need to move. Exercise is really important for the body, but also really for brain health.
Is there a type of exercise that is something you recommend in particular?
I recommend a type of exercise that you like, enjoy, and can really stick to. What happens, I think, is that we're surrounded by trends that sometimes are just impossible to embrace, especially now that so many people can't go to the gym, or trends come and go. It was high intensity interval training a little while ago, perhaps still is. There are all these things that are just, they may work for one person and not at all for another. And what is very important, especially for women, is to just move your body consistently. And actually, for women, there's a lot of research showing that a lower intensity exercise, low to moderate intensity exercise done more frequently, is particularly beneficial for brain health. There's like an inverted U shape between intensity and gains, where if the intensity is too low, you have no gains. For moderate intensity, you have the maximum gain. And then if the intensity is too high, the gains go down actually rather than improve.
So, Dr. Mosconi, what would be some examples of that kind of intensity where women would get the maximum benefit?
So, for example, brisk walking. Like if you walk a little bit fast, like as if you were late for a doctor's appointment, how's that? That's very helpful. So it's about 2.5 miles an hour. Or taking a bike ride, a speed of 7 to 10 miles per hour. Or gentle swimming. Or like, well, I mean, do people go to the swimming pool these days? I'm not sure, probably not. But running on the elliptical machine at a slow but steady stride, or even some mind-body exercises such as yoga or tai chi or resistance training, as long as you get warm, as long as you feel your heart beating a little bit harder than otherwise. And then there are, of course, fitness classes, and dancing is a good one if anyone enjoys dancing. I'm personally running now that my daughter is in school.
Uh-huh. And I actually got out the vacuum cleaner this morning and cut a pretty good short workout vacuuming the bedrooms.
And actually doing stairs. I would say so many people say to me, I can't go to the gym. I don't have time to exercise. I'm like, but you have stairs. Do them.
Yes.
Do 30 minutes of stairs, up and down, up and down, up and down. You'll feel it. Your legs will hurt. Your heart will start pumping. So do stairs. Or another really good one is plank. Do you plank?
Yes, I do like that one. Yes.
And Dr. Mosconi, I'd like to point out that of the research that's been done in this field, exercise is one of those things that really seems to be associated with a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. So, there's science here.
Yes, yes, for sure. I'm not just improvising. Yes, there's a lot of research on exercise, and we know that exercise lowers the risk of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease, both in women and men, but perhaps even more so in women than in men. There are studies showing a benefit very specifically for women at all ages. And this could be because women are less likely than men to exercise to start with, for a number of reasons that have to do with family expectations, raising kids, holding full-time jobs while taking care of the family, more stress and more perceived stress, or menopause and hormonal changes and whatnot. But for women, yes.
Dr. Mosconi, we definitely are big fans of exercise, but I would like to know what else we can do. You have a grandmother who developed Alzheimer's disease. I have a mother who is in her mid-90s. She I don't know if it's Alzheimer's disease or some other type of dementia, but clearly she is very cognitive impaired. Mm-hmm. I would prefer not to become cognitively impaired like that myself. What can I do, and what should I do to figure out where my risks really lie?
Right. So in order to figure it out, I think it's really important to work with somebody like us. So I'm Associate Director at the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medicine, and I am the Director of the Women's Brain Initiative at Weill Cornell. And what we do is very thorough Alzheimer's prevention evaluations that include brain scans. And for me, since I do have a family history of Alzheimer's and I'm quite concerned about my own risk and the risk for my mom and for my daughter now, I'm definitely getting a brain scan. Actually, I was supposed to get my brain scan before COVID hit, and I'm going hopefully in 2 weeks, because it's so important to have a baseline. As you know, any clinician will tell you, you want to have a baseline before there are any problems, because that's really the best way to look for changes. Like if there is a decline or an improvement, you won't know unless you can compare your current scan with a scan where you definitely had no problems. So I would strongly recommend thinking about joining an Alzheimer's prevention clinic, or even just being aware that such a service exists. It's difficult to find. There aren't that many clinics in the United States, but they're growing very fast. For things you can do today, I like to mention 8 that are the most important ones, and they involve mental stimulation or intellectual activity, exercise, which we talked about, nutrition and diet, sleep. I don't know if you sleep enough. I don't. Stress reduction, avoiding toxins, really important, environmental toxins especially, being socially engaged, or at least knowing that you have a support group that reduces anxiety and supports health over time, or just this feeling of belonging that's been associated with better cognitive outcomes later in life, and of course, regular medical checkups.
That sounds like a great list. We should all be paying attention to it. Let me ask you about environmental toxins.
There are some toxins that are known endocrine disruptors, and for a really long time, scientists did not believe that environmental toxins were actually an issue, but it turns out that some toxins in particular are called xenoestrogens or foreign estrogens, and they very clearly disrupt the neuroendocrine system, especially in women, pregnant women most of all, and children. So this is something to really keep in mind and look into, because we're literally drowning in materials and products that contain these chemicals that are harmful for hormones, plastic being number one. And we drown in plastic as a society. So I think it's really important for all of us, but also for the planet, to reduce the amount of plastic that's being used on a daily basis.
We have been we've been on the warpath against those plastics for decades. So thank you for sharing that. We are almost out of time, Dr. Mosconi, and I do want to mention hormones. You mentioned that at the very beginning of the show, how male brains and female brains are different. We had an acquaintance decades ago whose wife developed Alzheimer's disease. And at some point, he reinstituted estrogen in her regimen. And it made a huge difference for a couple of years. And then she continued her decline. I'm just curious about things like estradiol.
Like hormonal replacement therapy.
Exactly.
Yes, taking hormones. Yes, this is something we're looking into right now. There's a lot of research done on hormonal replacement therapy, estrogen replacement, and bodily health, right? So reduction of osteoporosis and vaginal dryness. We know that estrogen replacement therapy can help in many ways, but the research on brain health is very confusing. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just give you the super short answer that what we've learned of the effects of hormonal therapy specifically on the brain is that there's a window of opportunity during which it's beneficial to take hormones. But before and after this window, then the hormones don't help anymore. It can actually harm your brain, especially after. So it looks like if you take hormones within 6 years of menopause, there may or may not be benefits on cognitive health, but at least they don't harm you. Whereas if you start taking the hormones more than 6 years after menopause, they're not helpful from a cognitive perspective, from an Alzheimer's disease reduction perspective, but they actually increase the risk of ischemic damage in some women, not all women, just in some women. And we need a lot more work to find out what happens if you're taking hormones before menopause or within 6 years of menopause and you keep taking it, whether or not it's better to stop taking hormones, what kind of hormonal formulations are best. Most of the studies that I just mentioned look at oral estrogens, which are much more aggressive than transdermal or topical solutions. So we need more research into these peripheral formulations and just to really appreciate how effective they are for brain health. For me personally, I really want to start the research prior to menopause. I believe that, well, I hope that hormonal therapy might be particularly helpful if started early enough that the whole system is supported. Because if you try to reintroduce the hormones when the receptors that we were talking about before have already shut down, then it's not going to help. So we really need to better understand the timeline as far as our brains are concerned.
Dr. Lisa Mosconi, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today. We've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Lisa Mosconi, Director of the Women's Brain Initiative and Associate Director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College. She also serves as Associate Professor of Neuroscience in Neurology and Radiology. In addition, she's an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Department of Psychiatry. She's the author of Brain Food, and her latest book is The XX Brain, the groundbreaking science empowering women to maximize cognitive health and prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
And by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1231. The number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. You could subscribe to our podcast through Apple, Stitcher, Google, or your favorite podcast provider. We post it on the website every Monday morning.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.